Hi everyone, I am reading Age of Secrets, the Druids Brooch series number 8 by Christy Nicholas, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Finian flung the fishing net with all his might. The circular sieve spun wide and nestled onto the surface of the gently flowing Brooch River. Slowly the weights on the edge sank to the rocky floor. With gentle tugs, Finian pulled the hand line and tightened his snare. A few times the net caught on stones, but a slight twitch freed the twine. He frowned when he hauled the whole thing to shore. Only 3 small salmon and a young pike. Typically, he did much better at this time of the evening, as the sun kissed the edge of the dusky horizon. Still, he had plenty to eat and more for the market in the morning. Since he left home 7 winters before, he'd learned to balance his work and his needs pretty well. Perhaps just one more cast would be wise. He cleaned his catch, sniffed the fresh wind for a hint of rain, and finding none, waded back into the river. The river narrowed here at the sharp bend, making the current run swift and strong. It also corralled the fish into a smaller area. Finian whispered, urging the fish to come closer. His voice flowed out through the air and into the water. Sometimes they listened. More often, they fled. Fish grew naturally wary of any fisherman, despite his unique ability to talk to them. Just because they understood him didn't mean he had command over their actions. He avoided speaking with fish, especially since his voice, even with magic, got distorted through the water. He preferred talking with larger animals as they had more grasp of conversation. But sometimes he persuaded the fish to swim closer toward his net. A ripple upright caught his eye, glinting in the setting sun. Finian squinted as the disturbance grew closer. Something large swam beneath the surface, something he wouldn't want in his net. Hastily, he tried to pull the net in, but it caught on a rock and refused to budge. With frantic hands, he attempted to untie the hand line from his wrist, but the water-soaked knot stuck fast. No, no, no! Go away! Go around! The salmon ignored his imprecations and hummed a sprightly tune as he leapt, cutting the river's surface with a glint of silver and pink before barreling into the Finian's net. He held on for dear life as the fish plowed through, snapping the bits of braided horsehair and vine like a rotten bit of thatch. But the main part of the net held. The force pulled Finian well into the center of the river, spluttering and gasping for breath, like the fish he often tossed on shore. The water roared above him and into his lungs, forcing the breath from him. His panic rose as the current slammed him into a jagged rock. Pain shot through his midriff. He gasped when his face found air for a moment. The water snatched him away from blessed air. He gasped again. The water flooded his mouth. His lungs burned from lack of breath. The hand line cut deep into his wrist, digging through his soaked skin. He clawed at it as the water swept him downriver, but it remained tight. The raging current and the power of the large fish pulled him with surprising ease. The salmon wriggled through 2 more bends in the bank as Finian's sight dimmed. Gray surrounded him, and he faded. A wrench to his arms signaled the huge salmon tearing through the net. Finian scrabbled back to the surface. He grasped a huge breath, drawing sweet fresh air into his lungs. He continued to drift down the river, the destroyed net trailing behind him. With a set jaw and an angry step, Finian retrieved the shredded remains of his net and slogged back to the shore. He pulled the now useless net to the banks, squelching through the river mud and reeds to dry land. He wrapped it into a ball and considered throwing it back into the river, a just reward for the betrayal it caused. With a deep sigh, Finian tucked the awkward, sopping bundle under his arm and walked upriver. The net hadn't been at fault. A salmon the size had no business being this far up and rook. He lived leagues away from the sea, and only the smaller salmon made it this far past the weirs and the rapids. The hike to his small hut didn't take too long, despite the adventure in the river. The river wound through the countryside, but walking over land got him there much more directly. He didn't live in high style. The rough hut wouldn't last more than a winter or 2. He never bothered with the hard work anything more permanent would require. Not anymore. Not after the last time. His current home stood next to a large open area in the woods, nestled within a tight bend of the river. A small beach allowed easy access to the water, and a large flat rock lay next to the hut. This rock allowed Finian to spread out his net when it needed repairs, like today. It also made a great place to clean his catch. Finian lived a simple life, but he liked it simple. He craved human companionship, but daren't seek it out. He spoke to birds and squirrels, but they only spoke of sweet, simple things. They had no deep philosophies. From his net-preparing rock, he glanced up to watch the river as it meandered, wiggling his hands to keep them from aching. He bent back to his task with industry, determined to fix at least half the damage while the light of the day remained strong. Occasionally, he'd glance up at a sound or to stretch his back. It must have been a cursed fish or maybe some fairy conjuration. Regardless, his net had no chance against such a thing. Still, he jerked the strands with frustration as he repaired the net out on the big stone. He rose to go into his hut and retrieved his supply of thin rope. He'd need to make more. Although the ball of rope seemed hefty, repairs from this scale would use most of it up. When Finian sat again, he let out a deep sigh. He'd forgotten to stoke the fire. It remained banked from the morning, and if he didn't start it now, the night would fall before he had time to cook his meal. He stood again, peering at the river. A large log swung lazily along with the current, with something round and furry in the middle. Finian squinted to make out the object between the glints of the setting sun. The object lifted its head, and Finian recognized it to be a scraggly wolfhound, soaked and scrambling to stay on the branch. Without a thought, Finian rushed to the far end of the river bend to cut off the path of the log. He scurried down to the small beach and dove into the water, swimming with powerful strokes to reach the log before it floated away. He almost got a handhold before it spun away. With a spluttered curse, he yelled at the dog, "Come! Swim to me. I'll take you to safe shore." The dog lifted his head up with surprise. He'd never have heard anyone speak to him in words he understood. After a heartbreakingly long moment, the dog left the dubious safety of the soaked log and paddled toward Finian. The enormous dog almost dunked the man, but Finian rolled on his stomach, asking the dog to drape his paws over Finian's shoulders. "I'll bring us back to shore. Just keep your head above water." With both of them panting, he crawled to the beach and dropped on the sand. The dog did the same, his pink tongue flopping out of his mouth. When Finian caught his breath, he sat cross-legged next to the beast. The poor thing appeared half-starved and half-drowned. The silver-gray fur felt matted and patchy, and his gaunt frame showed through the skin. He patted the poor dog a few times while the beast breathed slow to a normal pace. "Stay here just a few moments, dog. I'll be back with some food, water, and nice cloth to dry you. When you're fed, I'll take you up to the fire and get you warm, eh?" The wolfhound opened his eyes once and closed them again, still exhausted. Finian took that as an assessment and climbed up the rough stairs he'd built into the hill. He gathered some fish from the day's catch, some turnips left over from yesterday's stew, and a skin of water. On the way down, he grabbed his blanket and returned to the beach. The dog hadn't moved so much as a paw, but breathed more easily. Finian noticed a gash on the dog's leg, and he dabbed it with river water. The dog whimpered, but let him work. With some urging, Finian convinced him to sit up enough to drink and eat. He took a little fish, but wouldn't touch the turnip. Finian didn't blame him for that. He didn't care for turnips either, and he lived too far from the ocean to spice it with salt often. "What's your name, boy?" "I'm Finian." The hound turned his head, and Finian heard his words within his mind. "Why can I understand you? I never understood other humans." Finian shrugged. "It's something I've been able to do for many seasons. My grandmother gave me a fairy gift when she left me." The dog shook his head as if the last bit didn't make sense. Finian supposed it didn't, to a dog. "I'm Bran. At least that's what my friend called me. It's the only name I've ever known." Bran, one of the two famous hounds of Fianna Macamhel, the legendary leader of the Fianna. A worthy name for an enormous wolfhound. "Do you want to be called Bran?" "If you'd rather another name, I'll call you something else." Bran shook his head. "Bran is good. I'll remember Bran. I don't remember things very well. That's why my friend sent me away." He ducked his head as if ashamed. Finian put a hand under Bran's chin and lifted until he gazed into the dog's eyes. "Hey, that was a mean thing for him to do. Would you like to be my friend? I promise I won't make you go away." The dog's tail thumped 3 times on the sand before he gave a cautious, "Yes, I would like that very much. Do you have more fish?" "My leg hurts." With a grin, Finian nodded. "I have more fish up at my hut and a warm fire. I'll wrap up your leg so it can heal. Here, let me dry you off first." Finian rubbed the wiry gray fur hard with the blanket, and Bran squirmed under him, the tail now wagging so hard it bruised Finian's arms. "Settle down, Bran, settle down. We'll be done here in a moment." Once Bran's coat felt fluffy and dry, Finian led him up the stone steps. Bran didn't like the steps, but made it to the top after several whines. When he spied the fire, though, he rushed next to it and lay down. "This is warm. I really like warm. Will you let me stay near the warm for a while?" With a chuck, Finian agreed. "You can stay next to the warm all night if you like. I'll be there too. The sun's going down, so the air will chill. Let me get more fish in the pot for my meal, and I'll give you the rest." He glanced over at the still ripped net and shrugged. He'd repair it in the morning. Keeping the hound warm and fed had more importance just now than the net. He wrapped Bran's leg with a strip of cloth and tied it well. Finian woke the next morning with a warm body next to his, all along his back. He didn't know who it was. He hadn't chatted with another person in a long time, much less been comfortable enough to fall asleep next to them. With cautious movements, he turned. In the dim light of the growing dawn, he made out the gray, furry form of Bran, stretched out almost as long as him, snoring slightly. Yesterday's events came rushing back into his memory, from the massive salmon to the nearly drowned dog. He peered at said hound, a half-smile on his face. He had had a dog once in his 8th summer. The puppy had loved him like no other. The dog had lived with him before Finian talked to animals, before his grandmother had disappeared. The puppy had been a mutt, some half-wolf hound from across the sea. At least that's what his grandmother had told him. He'd always believed her words. His father would tell lies all the time, just to make himself more important or impressive. But his grandmother had never lied to him. Finian gulped back the memories, got up from the warmth of the dog, and stoked the banked fire back to life. He poured some water into the tin kettle to heat for tea, and walked outside to greet the day. His parents had been fanatics of the new Roman religion, but his grandmother taught him the proper way to honor the dawn. He faced the east and sat, cross-legged, on the small outcropping of rocks, looking over the river. Finian waited for the sun's first rays to peek out from behind the hills and across the countryside. He closed his eyes as the sun touched his skin, smiling at the warmth. Then he sang. The song had no words, at least no words he recognized. The sounds he'd learned by rote, some old language she'd known. Or perhaps she didn't know the meaning either and just made the sounds, too. It didn't matter. They had called to the sun as the sun now called to him. He drew in the power of the beams, energizing his body and his soul with the promise of the new day. When the bottom of the shimmering orb cleared the hill, he allowed his song to fade, to blend into the song of the surrounding birds. He allowed the power within him to tumble into the earth below him, curling away like a heavy smoke from a smoldering fire. When he'd released the strength back into the soil, his body and soul remained refreshed and ready for what lay before him. Finian walked back to the hut where Bran still lay sleeping, now curled into a ball next to the flickering flames of the hearth fire. He needed more fish for breakfast. Yesterday's catch had been enough to feed himself for 2 days, but not himself and a starving wolfhound. To get more fish, he needed to repair his net. With a determined stride, he walked to his abandoned project from the day before and bent to his task. He pulled a length of thin rope braided with horsehair, thin vines, and reed stalks. He tied fast knots to one side of the enormous gap remaining from yesterday's fiasco and tied the other end to the opposite side of the gap. Once he finished, he tied parallel lines across the gap until he had everything in that direction. Now for the hard part. He then added rope crossways, tying new knots at every juncture. This step took much longer than the first pass, and he had to get up often to stretch his legs and back. The hound still slept. Finian smiled every time he glanced at his hut. He hoped Bran would want to stay. It would be nice to have a friend. Just as he tied the last knot of the main gap, a loud yawn came from the hut. Bran stretched and rolled over, but he didn't wake. He held up his repaired net, searching for bits he'd missed. There, that knot didn't seem secure. He retied it and tested the fastness of the net as a whole. tugging and pushing across. A sloppy job now meant empty bellies later. If Bran stayed, he had 2 bellies to fill, and failure would mean just his own hunger. Thanks.